In 2018, Snapped featured the controversial story of Crystal Mangum, a woman already synonymous with scandal in the city of Durham, North Carolina.
She was involved in one of the most notorious cases that we'd ever seen.
She could never get away from the spotlight.
When she met Reginald Day, Crystal believed she'd found the safety she'd always dreamed about.
He wanted a family, he wanted love, he wanted to just be at peace, enjoy life.
But a brutal attack would destroy their relationship in an instant.
Yeah, 911.
My uncle just got stabbed.
It was a steak knife buried to the hilt.
She claims he tried to choke her.
With her reputation preceding her, Crystal faces an uphill legal battle as some question her credibility.
You have to ask yourself, can that person get a fair and impartial jury of their peers?
Now, more than a decade into her prison sentence, Crystal Mangum shares her side of the story.
He was the aggressor, and I was no match for him. They just arrested me. They didn't ask me what happened or anything.
I believe the police treated my mom not as the victim that she was because of what happened with Duke.
As she fights for vindication, others question her inability to take responsibility for her actions.
At the end of the day, he wouldn't have been in the hospital if he hadn't been stabbed. And there's no doubt that the injuries were part of the reason that he was in such a critical medical situation.
I'm just grateful to be alive. I regret that he lost his life. I just don't know how else things could have turned out. I felt like I didn't have any other choice. My name is Crystal Gail Mangum. I decided to do this interview because I want people to know the truth surrounding Reginald Day's death. It's frustrating to know that I'm sitting in jail for a crime that not only I didn't commit, but a crime that doesn't exist.
Even after all these years of being in prison, with all that Crystal has been through, you know, she's at a space now that it's hard for her to accept responsibility for any of her actions. She is set to be released soon, and this is not the end of her story. It's still being written.
April 3rd, 2011. At 2:30 a.m., local resident Carlos Wilson calls 911 in a panic after his uncle and neighbor, 46-year-old Reginald Day, shows up at his apartment door.
Yeah, 911, where's your emergency?
I need an ambulance. My uncle just got stabbed and it's near his lungs.
I held Reginald's room, talked to him, trying to get him to calm down, because I didn't want his heart rate to exceed so much where it would pump all the blood. You know, he was bleeding profusely.
Is he awake?
Yeah, but he needs help bad.
Oh, we're getting help on the way. Someone else is dispatching the police and the EMS there.
Durham Police Department shows up, and then your first responders, which would be the fire department.
They wasted no time doing what they needed to do, loading him up and taking him to the hospital.
While Reginald is transported for care, officers face the difficult task of determining who attacked him and why. Born in 1964, Reginald Day grew up in a small town just outside of Durham.
He's a country boy. He liked the outdoors. He liked to fish. Occasionally, he liked him a Budweiser.
Known for his hard-working personality, Reginald supported himself with a passion for painting houses.
He liked to paint. He was just so thrilled about painting, you know, just beginning from the prepping of the wall to the finished product. And he always told me that you can never go wrong with learning a trade, no matter what the trade may be.
He was somebody that enjoyed helping other people. He was kind, had a pretty simple life, and he just wanted someone to share it with.
In 2011, a friend hired Reginald to do some work around her house, which is where he first met 32-year-old Durham native Crystal Mangum.
My mother, she was very outgoing, just life of the party, had this kind of exuberance feel about her. Like, she was so upbeat.
Crystal was also ambitious.
I started out at IBM making computers. That was quite interesting. And then I worked at Nortel Networks for a while. I worked at Mitsubishi. Then I went on to join the Navy as an operations specialist. I'm very proud that I was in the Navy and that I served my country. That was one of the best decisions I could have made.
In 1999, Crystal met a fellow sailor and they had 2 kids. Sadly, their relationship ultimately ended. Shortly thereafter, she was honorably discharged.
She moves back to Durham to be near her family, to be closer to her father and her mother, so she could have a support system, because she did have 2 small children. Crystal was about 26 at that time and wasn't getting a lot of support from the father.
She was a single mother and just doing what she could to provide for us. While she was raising us, she was still going to college, and she ended up getting her bachelor's degree in psychology. And that moment when I saw her walk across the stage, I was really proud of her.
She seemed to be very driven and very focused. It was like she knew what she wanted and she was going to go after it.
Growing up, it was mainly me, my mom, my grandparents on my mom's side, RJ, until I was 7 when Kayla was born, which is our little sister.
Unfortunately, Crystal's relationship with the father of her 3rd child didn't last.
It was really hard for me to support my kids, but I was trying to save up money to move out.
In an effort to keep her head above water, Crystal moved in with her aunt in 2010. That's when she met Reginald Day.
Reginald came over. He was very quiet. To me, very attractive. He would come in and bring his painting equipment and just start working. And he was very confident in what he was doing, and he did a good job. We hit it off. He was down to earth. So I asked him, did he need a roommate?
My mother came and she told us that she had a place for us to stay, and then she introduced me to Reginald.
Once she was there, things started to happen. There was more than a roommate situation.
Reggie Day fell very hard quickly for Crystal Mangum.
He was very happy at first. It was like that honeymoon stage they were going through.
Crystal was just as taken with Reginald and appreciated how well he treated her children.
Reggie loved kids, period. He bonded with them. He did what he could to make them feel welcome.
Crystal did notice that he drank regularly, especially after coming off of work. But she thought they had a good relationship, and she was satisfied being in that relationship.
He wanted a family. He wanted love. He wanted to just be at peace, enjoy life.
Nearly 2 months after Crystal moved in with Reginald, their life together appears to be in mortal danger after he is attacked.
He was being taken to the hospital for emergency surgery.
By the time law enforcement arrive on the scene, the woman they ultimately track down for the attack has fled.
I was still in fight or flight mode after I stabbed him. I didn't even have enough strength to call the police. It took all the strength in me just to run. All I could think about was getting to my kids. All I could think about was those pretty little faces saying, "Mommy, are you okay? Mommy, please just get to us." That's all I could think about. I gotta get to my kids. Because being a mom means everything to me.
I'm asleep on the couch downstairs at my Nana's house, and I just hear a bang on the door, like do. You know, I kind of thought it was a dream at first, and then I see my Nana open the door. My mom comes running in, stumbling, falling on the floor. She kept saying, "I stabbed him."
And then my son called the police and went through a period of shock. I felt at my lowest.
Coming up, as detectives begin their investigation, Crystal's connection to one of Durham's most notorious cases reemerges.
Here in Durham, North Carolina, everybody knows who Crystal Mangum is.
It was just ridiculous. Like, my heart hurt, my eyes hurt from crying. Like, I just didn't know what to do. They built a caricature of me, like the crazy, mad black woman. And so how do I maneuver and make my way in this world?
In the early morning hours of April 3rd, 2011, Reginald Day's life hangs in the balance after being stabbed.
In this case, we had one wound. It was one wound that transected from the liver, the spleen, and I think to part of his lung. And it was consistent with being someone who was just basically defending themselves and trying to get away.
While Reginald is rushed into surgery, his nephew Carlos leads Durham police to the scene of the crime. The moment they walk into Reggie's apartment, it's clear that a violent struggle had occurred.
Initially, I see this knife stabbed into the armrest of the couch. As I proceed around through the kitchen, I see knives that are out of a knife block, but they kind of scattered across the kitchen floor. And you kind of see a trail of these that lead to the bathroom. And then we also found a blade in the bedroom as well. There was also a door to the bathroom that had like fist holes punched in it. And then, of course, there were some blood drops that we could see from the master bedroom as well as in the bathroom, and then also leading through the living room out toward the main door to the apartment.
Reginald's nephew tells police his uncle claimed the person who stabbed him was his girlfriend, Crystal Mangum.
Here in Durham, North Carolina, everybody knows who Crystal Mangum is.
The events that transformed Crystal Mangum into one of Durham's most notorious public figures date back to 2006, long before she met Reginald Day.
While she was in school, you have financial aid and everything, but that doesn't take care of everything. You still have to pay your bills.
To make ends meet, Crystal started working as an exotic dancer for private parties.
That's something that she chose to do because she can make $300-400 for an hour's worth of work.
On the night of March 13th, 2006, the gig Crystal had booked was supposed to be a party like any other.
Crystal Mangum had been hired by a group of Duke lacrosse students to come and perform for a party that they were having on campus at their house. She attended this party. She was getting paid to provide this exotic dancing services.
What happened next would forever alter the course of Crystal's life and that of the Duke lacrosse team.
Crystal immediately reported that she had been sexually assaulted by multiple individuals involved with the Duke lacrosse team.
She went to the hospital for a rape kit, and then she's interviewed about what happened at that house. Police officers show her a picture of the team, and that's how she picked out 3 people from that picture.
Once that was reported, there was a frenzy of media reports as well as police response, and even response from the district attorney's office, who demanded immediate attention and immediate action in the case.
Ultimately, 3 lacrosse players were indicted. This case was the perfect storm. The perception of Duke from many people is that it is an elitist university for privileged young people. So you have that on one hand. Then on the other hand, you have a low-income African-American woman down on her luck, having a difficult life, and she accuses these 3 young men from the university of a horrible crime.
Crystal really was kind of the focus of a national fight over civil rights, over black rights, over women's rights, over all of those kinds of things. It split America right down the middle.
But even as Crystal's accusation divided Durham and dominated the national news, the case against the lacrosse players started to unravel.
The DNA tests came back and showed that none of the players that she had accused had any DNA connection to her allegations of sexual assault. The Attorney General decides that not only was this a case of a false accusation, but that these men were totally innocent.
Crystal Mangum continued to stand by her claims, but her support dwindled.
After 2006, she was pretty much a pariah or a persona non grata in this community.
Her name is synonymous, so no job, no way to make ends meet.
Crystal Mangum, after this incident, found it difficult, if not impossible, to rent an apartment.
I was trying really hard. I put in so many applications, my hands got tired. Like, it was just ridiculous. Like, my heart hurt, my eyes hurt from crying. Like, I just didn't know what to do, and I had 3 kids.
Me and my mother and my sisters, we moved around a lot, bouncing from house to house. We even lived at a homeless shelter at one point.
Shunned by the community, Crystal desperately needed a refuge, one that she found in 2011 when Reginald Day invited her to move in.
I told him, I said, there's one thing that I need to tell you. That we need to get out in the open. I feel like I've been blacklisted, and there's just no other reason other than I am Crystal Mangum. So he said, well, I understand and I appreciate your honesty.
Nearly 2 months after Crystal and her children moved in with Reginald, he's fighting for his life in a Durham hospital. Police must determine if Crystal was in fact the one to attack the man who had taken her in.
There was immediate notification of most of the supervisors and command staff due to, her previous involvement from the Duke lacrosse case. So when I was notified that she was involved, I knew that it was going to be a major incident and that we needed to basically have all hands on deck.
They just arrested me. They didn't ask me what happened or anything.
Hours after Reginald Day was stabbed in his apartment, Durham police are on the hunt for the alleged perpetrator, his girlfriend, Crystal Mangum.
Our uniformed patrol officers and our investigators were actively trying to locate Miss Mangum. We wanted to make sure not only to get her side of the story as far as what occurred, but also address if she had any particular physical injuries that had resulted from this act of violence.
With one team of officers processing the crime scene at Reginald's apartment, another heads to the apartment where Crystal fled and where her son called 911.
That night is kind of still blurry to me. I remember making a phone call, but I don't really remember speaking on the phone to the police. But yeah, I called the police, I talked to them.
Durham 911, where's your emergency?
Yes, this dude was trying to beat my mom, and my mom was trying to defend herself, and she accidentally stabbed him.
Okay, tell me exactly what happened.
Please just hurry up and get here. It really is a lot of trouble, and we just need you to get here really seriously.
She kept telling me that, he was beating her, that she did it in self-defense. I was definitely scared for her. I had never seen her frantic like that. It hurt me to see her like that and just crying on the floor, hysterical. About 10 minutes later, they showed up. They got her up off the floor, put her in handcuffs.
When they got to the apartment, they didn't ask me any questions. They just said, "Get up, Crystal."
The investigators then advised me that they had located Crystal and that she was going to be at police headquarters and that I would need to respond there at some point to document her with photographs and also collect a DNA sample from her. When I arrived at police headquarters, I went and met with Crystal. She was in a secured interview and interrogation room at the police department. I'll get you a stamp on this wall. I documented her with photographs and also got the DNA swab. She consented to that and didn't mind being cooperative with me at all. I observed her physically distraught. She was upset, and she appeared like she had been in an assault. Her hair was just a mess. She had a swollen face. She had wounds on her hand and her arms that was consistent with being defensive wounds. And she didn't speak a lot.
Crystal had been through the system before, so she knew that it was best to just ask for an attorney rather than try to talk your way out of it. She knew that it was better not to talk to the police until after you've had a consult with an attorney, so she never spoke.
With Crystal remaining silent, authorities treat her injuries and file charges.
They immediately put me in jail. They charged me with assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill. I felt like there was no reason to be alive. I might as well just end it right here. And then I thought about my kids. That was the only thing that really helped me to keep it together. Because if I didn't have them, I wouldn't be here today.
It was really hard. Like, I was really attached to my mom. And I had to, try to be a man on my own. And not have your mama there to pick you back up or just do the small things that you don't even realize until you don't have it,
After booking Crystal into the Durham County Jail, detectives contact the hospital for an update on Reginald's status.
The stab wound was 7.5 inches deep. I mean, it was a steak knife buried to the hilt. It hit the colon, the spleen, I think the kidney, but they repaired all of the damage.
Prognosis from the medical doctors was positive, and they felt that he would make a recovery, but he was still listed as critical.
This was one of those cases where everything looked like it was going in one direction, and then in a split second, everything turned, and that changed Crystal Mangum's future.
Coming up, Reginald's story surprises investigators.
He admits hitting her.
And Crystal Mangum breaks her silence.
I'm not responsible for his death.
In my eyes, it was total self-defense.
Durham police are investigating the stabbing of Reginald Day by his girlfriend, Crystal Mangum, when doctors announce he is expected to make a full recovery.
About 2 days later after the incident, Reginald Day was recovering in the hospital, and myself and major crimes investigators, we responded to the hospital to speak with him.
Reginald tells detectives that April 2nd, 2011 was supposed to have been a big day for him and Crystal.
Their relationship had kind of gotten to a new level. Reggie had actually taken her to a family picnic to meet his family. This was the first time that, he had kind of said, this is my girlfriend, here's my family.
But Reginald says that their special day soon turned sour.
When they come home from the party, there is a police officer who is in the parking lot of the apartment complex dealing with a car that's being towed. Crystal knows him, and Crystal goes up and speaks to him.
Reggie got jealous, saying, I just introduced you to my whole family. What are you doing? Why are you flirting?
They got in a heated argument.
The officer said, are you okay? She was like, no, we're fine. Then he said, well, then y'all can't be out here yelling. Go inside.
Reginald tells detectives that he and Crystal complied with the officer's order, but he admits that the argument quickly escalated inside.
He had been drinking, and he just got insanely jealous.
He admits hitting her. He admits jumping on her. He admits all of that.
He stated that Miss Mangum had fled into the bathroom and locked the door behind her, and that he pursued her by forcing the door in to go after her.
Reggie said that he kicked the door in, that he actually had pulled her hair.
He admits pulling her hair and pulling her back into the room.
Mr. Day told investigators that at the time that he grabbed her hair, Miss Mangum stated to let me loose. His statement and the context of the scene determined a conclusion of self-defense. The injuries that I observed on Miss Mangum would appear that she had been on the receiving end of an assault as well.
Reginald claims at that point he came to his senses and released Crystal, but the fight was far from over.
His position was he let her go, turned to leave. She ran into the kitchen and grabbed some knives and came back at him and stabbed him once in the side.
He said that I was the aggressor, but I don't know where he got that from. He was the aggressor.
The only two people who know exactly how that went down are Crystal Mangum and Reginald Day. But everybody has a breaking point, especially if they've been drinking, and especially if they're triggered in a relationship by something that really upsets them and pushes them over the edge.
For somebody to say they love you and to treat you so kind and then turn around and beat you, it was really hard for me to process that.
While Crystal remains in custody, detectives continue building their case until the evening of April 6th, when Reginald's condition takes an unexpected turn for the worse.
My mom called me and told me that he wasn't doing good. And I'm like, huh? I'm assuming that he was going to walk out the hospital in a few days.
He started experiencing agitation and some issues. They were wondering whether or not it was delirium tremens. Was he an alcoholic coming off that?
If you don't treat alcoholism, detox will kick in. And that's one of the worst drugs you can ever detox from because it affects all the organs in the body, the whole body as a whole.
He starts running a fever and at some point goes into cardiac arrest, in which obviously doctors activate their medical procedures and start doing everything they can to provide life-saving measures for Mr. Day.
Doctors scramble to restart Reginald's heart, but they can't save him.
He was in a coma for a period of time, and if he was able to survive the coma, would probably be living with substantial brain damage.
After they realized he wasn't going to recover, that's when they went ahead and pulled the plug.
It was the family's decision to pull life support.
On April 13th, 2011, 10 days after the stabbing, Reginald Day is pronounced dead.
I was shocked, kind of, because I thought he was just going to be okay and he was going to survive.
From a legal standpoint, Reginald's death has dire consequences for Crystal.
Ultimately, for Miss Mangum, the charges that went along with this had now changed. It's gone from being an assault on Mr. Day to murder.
In Durham, North Carolina, Reginald Day has succumbed to his injuries 10 days after being stabbed in his apartment.
The complications, the combination of being an alcoholic and then being stabbed caused him to die.
It was very shocking. It was very disappointing. It was hurting. It was angry. It was so many emotions at one time because I'm assuming that I would see my uncle again, standing upright, walking and talking, being his happy, normal self. And I never got that chance to see him standing upright again. I had to watch him laying in a coffin, and I never thought that was going to happen.
Facing a first-degree murder charge and the possibility of life in prison, Crystal decides it's time to talk. Given her reputation in Durham, her attorney decides she should give a statement directly to the district attorney. Crystal's story initially mirrors Reginald's account of the day he brought her to meet his family.
He was already drunk before they even left. And I remember she went to grab her phone to call somebody, and he dragged her off the bed in front of us.
He kept telling, like, come on, let's go, drop the kids off at Nana's house. and like, let's go. He kept rushing her to get out the house, and we kept telling her, like, Mom, don't go. I just had a bad feeling about it. And yeah, she ended up leaving with him to go to the party.
Crystal says that around 1 a.m., she and Reginald returned home from the party. She tells the DA about stopping to say hello to the police officer she knew.
I dropped his hand mistakenly and went over and started talking to the officer. I had had a few drinks, and I was attracted to the officer, and I think he could see that. And I think the officer was attracted to me. So he was jealous.
That made Reggie angrier than he already was. By the time they got into the apartment and the door closed, he just hit her.
Reginald started yelling at me, and he hit me. I hit the floor, and that made him angrier. I locked myself in the bathroom to get away from him. What more could I do? I'm just glad my kids weren't there at the time. He kicked the door in. He was not in his right mind.
Crystal corroborates Reginald's claims that he eventually walked away. But she says it was Reginald who returned from the kitchen with the knives.
Crystal says that Reginald Day went in there, grabbed them, and started throwing them at her as though she were target practice.
She claims that she's trying to hide and dodge them. Eventually, they end up on the floor. She claims he tried to choke her.
I was 140 pounds and 5'4". He's 188 pounds, 5'9", and I was no match for him. So I stabbed him to get him off of me.
Authorities are wary of Crystal's claims due to her prior accusations against the Duke lacrosse team that didn't hold up in court.
I believe the police treated my mom not as the victim that she was, but because of what happened with Duke. She was just judged based off of who they thought she was, and it was a lot going against her and not too much going for her.
The next morning, Crystal Mangum is once again headline news in Durham when she's charged with second-degree murder.
It really hurt me for people to accuse my mother of being a murderer, because that's not the person that she is.
I felt like I was being beaten all over again. I felt like he'd won. Like everybody was laughing at me. I felt like it was okay for him to do what he did. I felt worthless. I felt like I didn't matter, like nobody cared.
Coming up, as the trial gets underway, prosecutors hope that a key witness from Crystal's past will seal her fate.
Crystal once again finds herself in this situation where she is the villain.
And a bombshell report allows Crystal to look toward the future.
It is Dr. Weck's opinion that Crystal did not kill Reginald Day.
The truth is on my side. I knew that the truth would prevail. I didn't know that it would take 12 years.
Two and a half years after Reginald Day's death, 35-year-old Crystal Mangum is headed to trial for his murder.
My biggest fears were that people were going to judge me based on the Duke case and not on the facts.
On November 14th, 2013, Crystal's trial begins at the Durham County Courthouse. In his opening statement, Crystal's attorney makes the case for self-defense.
By his own admission, she had locked herself into a bathroom and he kicked in the door and drug her out by her hair, at which point he was stabbed. She had every reason to be terrified of him, had every reason to think he was going to harm her.
The prosecution, however, paints Crystal as a dangerous woman with a long history of volatile behavior.
The prosecution portrayed her as a woman who had a lack of self-control, as a woman who was on the edge, and a woman who, frankly was going to snap at any time.
In court, they made it seem like I was the aggressor.
To bolster their case, the state calls their star witness, an ex-boyfriend of Crystal's named Milton Walker, to discuss a domestic assault case that occurred 1 year prior to the attack on Reginald Day.
Milton Walker took the stand and said she threatened to kill me with knives. She then burns all his stuff in the bathtub. And of course, he also calls 911 and they arrested her. And when it was first reported in 2010, I was a reporter at that time, and we all went to the house. It was pretty violent. It was pretty violent. And he did believe he was going to be killed.
Milton's testimony was bad for us because it set the pattern of when she gets mad at somebody, she will actually go grab a weapon and come back.
Crystal has this pattern in life where she seems to find herself in unhealthy and failed relationships and in an unfortunate situation of being the villain when it all wasn't on her.
On November 22, 2013, the jury is quick to reach a guilty verdict.
When they read the verdict of guilty, I thought, Lord, help me. I just didn't have any more faith in the judicial system. At that point, I felt like I was all alone. And I just felt like I was just free falling into a whole new world.
Following the verdict, the judge sentences Crystal to 14 to 18 years in prison.
All Reginald wanted was to be loved, to have a family of his own, something that he tried to do with Miss Crystal Mangum, to love her and care for her and her kids, and it was the death of him.
Between 2013 and 2018, all of Crystal's appeals are denied.
Life in prison is a whole new world. It's like everything you're waiting for is to be released. The best moments that I've had in here is the support. Support from staff, inmates, simple things you appreciate.
6 years after being convicted, Crystal is given hope when a bombshell report raises questions about the cause of Reginald Day's death.
It started out when my attorney gave me a copy of my discovery. There was an email from an anonymous tipper saying that someone discovered that there was an errant misplaced tube that was responsible for Reginald Day's death, and that it was not the stab wound that was responsible.
Crystal and her new attorney contacted Dr. Cyril Wecht for an official review.
Dr. Wecht is a well-renowned forensic pathologist, and he wrote this report stating that I'm innocent.
I'm Dr. Wecht's assistant. I started my career in forensics with him back in 2000 as an intern. Dr. Wecht's work reviewing cases and working as an expert consultant, has had convictions overturned.
When Dr. Wecht studied Reginald's medical records, he believed the stab wound was not the cause of death.
Dr. Wecht's report, after reviewing everything, he felt that the surgery was successful. There was no documentation that there was any trauma to the thoracic cavity. Reginald Day went into respiratory distress. To help him get oxygen, the intent was to place an endotracheal tube into his trachea. And it looks like on the first attempt that they actually placed that tube into the esophagus. Unfortunately, they did not catch that. And so he was deprived of oxygen, which ultimately caused irreversible brain damage per the medical records.
According to the findings, Reginald Day's autopsy report failed to mention the mistake.
It is Dr. Wecht's opinion that Crystal did not kill Reginald Day, that it was an accidental death. due to a mistake at the hospital.
Reginald Day died not from homicide. The stab wound had nothing to do with his death.
At the end of the day, he wouldn't have been in the hospital if he hadn't been stabbed. And there's no doubt that the injuries were part of the reason that he was in such a critical medical situation.
Crystal's actions beforehand are taking ownership of that space, what she could have done different. She doesn't seem to have any remorse in that area.
Crystal hopes Dr. Wecht's report will ultimately help vindicate her in the murder of Reginald Day.
The fact that the media is not reporting on it is surprising. I still feel optimistic because it's got to come out, and I know it's going to pay off.
I know that she's, fighting every day, and she's keeping high spirits, and she stays hopeful, that she's going to get out soon and she'll get her name cleared.
I'm just grateful to be alive, I regret that he lost his life. I felt like I didn't have any other choice.
My mom missed me graduate from high school, go to prom, go to college, get married, have a baby. She just missed me growing up.
I missed everything with my kids. And this is something that I can't get back. I don't even know how to reconcile any of that. But it's never too late.
The call came in just before dawn, a voice cracking through static. A dispatcher scribbling notes that would later be photocopied, stamped, filed, and forgotten, a single sentence cutting through quiet on an Arkansas morning in 1980. Something is wrong. Something is very wrong. And by the time the first cruiser rolled onto that dirt road, the air already felt heavier, like the land itself knew it was about to be dragged into a story that would not let go for decades. Headlights cut across tall grass soaked with dew, insects scattering, the smell of wet earth mixing with gasoline and nerves, and there was, half hidden by shadow, a scene that refused to make sense at first glance, the kind of scene that makes trained officers pause because instinct tells them this is not just another call. This is a moment that will echo, a body, not staged, not theatrical, just brutally final, lying where it had fallen, as if the night itself had spit it out and walked away. Word spread fast in a town where everyone knew everyone, where screen doors slammed and porch lights flicked on long before the sun rose, where neighbors leaned toward each other and whispered names, theories, fears. The victim was local, familiar, a face seen at the grocery store, at high school football games, at church on Sundays, a life folded neatly into routine until it was torn open in the dark. By mid-morning, the sheriff's office was crowded, phones ringing off the hook, deputies running on coffee and adrenaline, the pressure already building, the unspoken understanding that small towns don't get many murders, and when they do, they don't forget them. The crime scene told a story in fragments. Tire impressions pressed into soft ground, footprints overlapping like nervous pacing, a smear of something dark that caught the light in a way that made everyone look twice and then look away. There was no clear weapon in sight, no dramatic clue pointing a finger, just absence, gaps where answers should be. Photographs were taken, measurements logged, evidence bags labeled with dates that would become hauntingly important years later. At the time, it all felt urgent, solvable, close. The kind of case detectives believed would break in days, weeks at most. They started where they always start. Family, friends, last known movements, who saw the victim, who spoke to them, who might have argued, who might have followed, interviews blurred together, statements overlapping, alibis forming shaky lines that didn't quite hold. Some people were genuinely devastated, voices trembling as they talk about the last conversation, the last smile. Others were defensive, annoyed by the questions, eager to get back to their lives. Suspicion drifted to the town like smoke, settling on one person, and then another, never quite solid enough to ignite. The local paper ran headlines that felt too big for the town's narrow streets. Community shocked. Police seek leads. Violent crime rocks county. People read them over breakfast, folded them under their arms at the diner, pinned them to bulletin boards at work. Tips came in, some whispered, some shouted, some clearly fueled by old grudges or new fears. Every lead felt promising until it wasn't. Every knock on a door carried hope and dread in equal measure. Investigators worked long hours, reconstructing timelines, driving the same roads again and again, imagining what the victim might have seen in their final moments. Theories clashed in the cramped office, voices raised, then lowered. Was it personal? Random? Someone passing through? Someone hiding in plain sight? Without a clear motive, without a clean trail, the case began to stretch, the initial urgency slowly grinding against reality. Weeks turned into months. The crime scene tape came down, grass grew back, but the questions didn't fade. Evidence was boxed, cataloged, stored in rooms that smelled of dust and paper. Some items were revisited again and again, held up to the light, tested with the limited technology of the time, yielding nothing definitive. Other items were deemed unimportant, set aside, their potential unrealized. Decisions made under pressure with imperfect tools would later be scrutinized with a harshness no one could have imagined then. The town changed subtly. People locked doors they had never locked before. Parents kept children closer. Strangers were watched more carefully. Conversations lowered when unfamiliar faces entered the room. The murder became a reference point, a before and after moment, a story told in fragments to newcomers who asked why everyone seemed a little tense, a little wary. That was before, someone would say. That was after. As the first year passed, frustration crept in. Detectives rotated, some reassigned, some promoted, some burned out. The case file grew thicker, heavier, harder to navigate. New leads were thinner, more desperate. A witness would come forward claiming to remember something new, something crucial, only for the memory to collapse under scrutiny. Suspects were questioned, released, questioned again. Rumors hardened into beliefs, beliefs into accusations, accusations into silence. The victim's family lived in a suspended state. Grief tangled with hope, hope slowly eroding under the weight of unanswered questions. Anniversaries came and went, marked by quiet gatherings, by candles lit and blown out, by prayers that felt like they were floating into empty space. Each time the phone rang late at night, there was a flicker of possibility. Each time it was nothing. The disappointment cut deeper. By the time the second decade rolled around, the case had a new label, one that felt like an admission of defeat. Cold case. 2 words that sounded clinical but carried a heavy finality. The file was moved, literally and metaphorically, from the active stack to the archive. Not forgotten, officials would say, but waiting for technology, waiting for someone to talk, waiting for a mistake. Life moved on around it. Roads were repaved. Businesses closed and reopened under new names. Children who had been toddlers in 1980 graduated high school, left town, came back with families of their own. The murder remained, a scar beneath the surface, occasionally reopening when a documentary aired, when a journalist dug through old records, when a new sheriff promised to take another look. And somewhere in a box on a shelf, under fluorescent lights that flickered just a little too much, evidence sat quietly, unremarkable at first glance, overlooked not out of malice but out of limitation, a piece of the puzzle that did not yet know it was waiting for the future. At the time, no one could have imagined that this forgotten fragment would one day roar back into relevance, that would bridge the gap between a violent night in 1980 and a knock on a door decades later. For now, all anyone knew was that a life had ended, a community had been shaken, and the truth had slipped just out of reach, leaving behind only questions, echoes, and a case that refused to die. By the early 80s, the case had settled into the background noise of the county, not gone but muffled, like a radio left on in another room. And yet inside the sheriff's office it never fully slept. It just shifted position, moving from desk to desk as personnel changed, each new detective flipping to the same brittle pages, tracing the same underlined sentences, feeling the same mix of confidence and unease that their predecessors had felt, convinced at first that something obvious had been missed, and then slowly realizing how many times every obvious path had already been walked to exhaustion. The reports read like a looped nightmare, witness statements contradicting each other in small but crucial ways, timelines that almost aligned but never quite snapped into place, a map of the area marked and remarked with circles and arrows that now meant different things to different people depending on who was holding the pen. The crime scene photographs were still there, grainy and harsh, black and white images that froze a moment in a way memory never could, and every time someone studied them long enough, a new detail seemed to emerge, a shadow that looked like it might hide a footprint, a blur that could be a handprint or could be nothing at all, the kind of ambiguity that keeps investigators staring long past the point of usefulness. Evidence logs told a quieter story, one of procedure and protocol, of items collected carefully and then quietly shelved, each tagged with confidence that science would catch up eventually, that one day answers would be extracted from fibers and stains and fragments too small to matter yet. Outside the office, the town's relationship with the case grew complicated. Some people wanted it solved at any cost, demanded arrests, demanded closure, demanded to see someone held accountable even if certainty was thin. Others wanted it buried, tired of the way the murder hovered over every public gathering, tired of seeing outsiders driving with cameras and notebooks, tired of the implication that danger might still be lurking among them. Conversations became guarded. Old friendships cooled. A wrong look or an ill-timed comment could revive suspicions thought long dead. There were moments when it felt close, painfully close. A tip from a neighboring county about a man who matched a vague description, a drifter who had passed through around the time of the murder, triggered a flurry of activity. Detectives chasing down records, tracking movements across state lines, only to find the trail dissolving into nothing. Another time, a jailhouse informant claimed to know exactly who did it, spun a story dense with details that sounded convincing until checked against facts that didn't align. Each false dawn took something out of people working the case, a small erosion of optimism that added up over time. Technology crept forward in fits and starts. New forensic techniques were discussed in conferences and training sessions, spoken of with cautious excitement. But budgets were tight and priorities elsewhere. The evidence from 1980 remained largely as it was, sealed, preserved, waiting. Occasionally a box would be reopened, an item retested with slightly better methods, producing results that were clearer than before, but still not clear enough, still hovering just short definitive. Progress without payoff, motion without resolution. The victim's name never disappeared from local memory. It was spoken softly, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with anger, sometimes with resignation. Their family carried the weight publicly and privately, fielding questions from strangers who thought they were helping, from reporters chasing anniversaries, from officials offering reassurance that sounded rehearsed. They learned to live with two realities at once: the day-to-day demands of survival and the constant undercurrent of loss that never receded. Every year without an answer felt like a quiet betrayal. As the 90s arrived, the world outside Arkansas accelerated. News cycles sped up. Crimes elsewhere dominated attention. Yet the cold case lingered, now old enough to feel almost historical, referenced in training sessions as an example of how cases could stall, how crucial early decisions were, how evidence handling mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Younger officers listened nodding, thinking of it as a cautionary tale rather than a living wound. Then something shifted, subtly at first. A new administration came in with a renewed interest in unsolved crimes, spurred by public pressure and the growing promise of forensic science that could pull truths from places once thought useless. Grants were discussed. Cold case units were formed. Files long untouched were pulled from shelves, dust shaken loose. Pages spread out on tables under fresh eyes. The Arkansas case was among them, heavy with history, intimidating in its longevity. Re-examination began methodically, not with grand theories, but with basics. Who was interviewed? Who wasn't? What was tested? What wasn't? Which decisions were based on solid reasoning, and which were made under time pressure with limited information? It was slow, unglamorous work, the kind that rarely makes headlines, but it carried a different energy this time, a sense that the past could be interrogated with tools it never had before. Some witnesses were gone now, dead or unreachable, their memories locked forever. Others were older, changed, sometimes more willing to talk, sometimes less. Time had loosened tongues in a few cases, old loyalties fading, old fears diminishing. New interviews were conducted. careful not to contaminate recollections, but aware that memory itself is a fragile thing, reshaped by years of retelling and repression. Still, patterns emerge, not enough to accuse, but enough to suggest that the story told in 1980 had gaps that were never fully explored. The evidence room became a focal point. Boxes were opened one by one, contents inventoried again, photographed again, tested again. Items once dismissed as insignificant were now reconsidered in light of advances no one could have predicted. A fiber that once said nothing now hinted at origin. A stain that once defied analysis now promised a profile. A signature, a possibility. It was painstaking, expensive, and uncertain, but it was movement, and movement felt like hope. Not everyone welcomed the renewed scrutiny. Some people who had lived under suspicion for years felt the old anxiety return, the sense that no matter how much time passed, they would never fully escape the shadow of the crime. Others who had stayed silent out of fear or loyalty felt exposed, worried that their past choices might now carry consequences. The community buzzed quietly, rumors reawakening, speculation spreading again, this time with sharper edge because science was involved, because science sounded final. And yet, even as optimism grew within the investigative team, there was caution. They had seen this before, felt this before. Cold cases have a way of raising hopes only to dash them. Every promising development was met with skepticism. Every apparent breakthrough held at arm's length until verified and re-verified. The lesson to pass was clear. Certainty is rare and mistakes are costly. Still, something about this phase felt different. The questions being asked were better. The tools were stronger. The patience was deeper. The case, once a static archive, was becoming dynamic again, its pieces shifting, rearranging, suggesting new shapes. Somewhere within those boxes, within those pages, within those long-neglected fragments, the truth was stirring, not yet visible but no longer dormant. The Arkansas night of 1980 was still distant, its details blurred by time, but its echo was growing louder again, carried forward by technology, by persistence, by the refusal of a few determined people to let a life remain a footnote. The story was far from over, and though no one could yet say how it would end, there was a sense, quiet but unmistakable, that the silence surrounding the case was beginning to crack. The first real jolt came quietly, without sirens or press conferences, tucked inside a routine update that barely registered outside the task force. A technician's note scribbled at the bottom of a reanalysis request, a sentence that suggested an anomaly, a result that didn't fit the old conclusions and didn't fit dismissal either. It was the kind of thing that in another era might have been shrugged off, filed away as inconclusive, but now it triggered a pause, a second look, a decision to slow down instead of moving on. That pause mattered. It cracked a rhythm that had governed the case for decades, the rhythm of checking and shelving, and replaced it with something sharper, more deliberate. They pulled the original packaging again, careful hands opening seals that hadn't been disturbed in years. The smell of old paper and storage rooms filling the air, each item laid out under bright lights as if on an operating table. Gloves snapped on. Cameras clicked. Notes were taken with almost ritual precision. This wasn't nostalgia. This was surgery. Every fiber, every fragment, every speck that once seemed too small to matter was now treated as if it might speak, if asked the right way. The anomaly became a thread, and the thread led to other questions. Why had this item been logged the way it was? Why had its origin been described so vaguely? Why had it never been compared against certain samples collected later in the investigation? None of the answers pointed to malice. They pointed to time, to pressure, to a system that had once been forced to move fast with limited tools. Understanding that didn't excuse the gaps, but explained them, and explanation made it possible to move forward without bitterness. When results began to come back, they did so in cautious language, full of probabilities and margins and qualifiers, but beneath the technical phrasing was something unmistakable: distinction. This evidence did not belong where it was found. It had come from elsewhere, somewhere close enough to matter, somewhere connected to a person who had never been fully accounted for. The room felt smaller as that realization settled, the hum of equipment suddenly louder, the stakes suddenly higher. Investigators went back to the timeline, this time overlaying it with new data, new assumptions, new skepticism. Movements that once seemed coincidental now looked deliberate. Gaps that once felt like bad record-keeping now looked like opportunities. A window of time, narrow but real, opened up, suggesting that someone could have been present, could have interacted, could have left something behind without drawing attention. It didn't name a suspect, but it narrowed the universe in a way the case had never experienced before. Re-interviews followed, delicate and tense. People were older now, their faces lined with years that had nothing to do with the crime and everything to do with living under its shadow. Some were surprised to be called again. Others had expected it, had felt it coming. Questions were framed differently this time. Less accusatory, more precise, designed to test memory against evidence rather than emotion. Small inconsistencies surfaced, not dramatic lies, but shifts in emphasis. Hesitations where there had once been certainty, confidence where there had once been doubt. One interview, recorded late in the afternoon as daylight faded, produced a detail that seemed insignificant in isolation but electric in context. A comment about a vehicle, a color, a place it shouldn't have been parked. It matched nothing in the original reports because no one had known to ask the question then. Now, with the evidence pointing toward movement, toward transfer, toward contact, the details snapped into place like a missing tooth in a gear. Records were pulled, old registration databases, insurance logs, maintenance receipts, anything that could anchor that detail to reality. It took weeks. It took favors. It took patience. When the names surfaced, it did so without drama. Just a line on a screen, a file number, a person who had once lived close enough, worked close enough, brushed against the edges of the investigation without ever being pulled into its center. A person who had moved away not long after 1980, quietly, legally, leaving behind no obvious reason to follow. The task force didn't rush. They built, they verified, they cross-checked every assumption, every connection. The evidence was still circumstantial, still fragile, but it was converging now, multiple threads pointing toward the same silhouette. Not enough to accuse, enough to watch, enough to ask harder questions, enough to reopen doors that had been closed for a lifetime. As word leaked, carefully and incompletely, tension returned to the community. It felt different this time, less like rumor, more like inevitability. People spoke in lowered voices again. Old conversations were revisited with new intensity. Some felt relief, believing answers were finally coming. Others felt fear, sensing that truths long buried were about to surface, whether anyone was ready or not. Inside the task force, sleep became optional. The work took on a rhythm that was intense and consuming, days blurring into nights, nights into early mornings filled with coffee and quiet determination. Every step forward carried the weight of decades, the knowledge that mistakes now would not just delay justice, but potentially destroy the chance for it entirely. Precision wasn't just professional pride. It was moral necessity. The evidence continued to sharpen. What had once been noise was becoming signal. What had once been a cold, static file was now warm with possibility. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. The case was no longer drifting. It was moving with purpose, pulled forward by a clue so small that it survived unnoticed for years, and so powerful it was now threatening to rewrite everything believed about what happened in Arkansas in 1980. And as the walls closed in around a truth that had waited patiently for decades, the silence that had protected it began to fracture, not with a single loud break, but with a series of quiet, irreversible cracks. The knock came without warning, not loud, not aggressive, just firm enough to announce intention. And when the door opened, the past stepped into the present without asking permission. The man who answered had aged in the way people do when life keeps moving, but something unresolved stays lodged behind the eyes, his hair thinner, his shoulders narrower, his expression guarded before a single word was spoken. He recognized the badges immediately. People who lived through 1980 always did. Some memories didn't need explanation. They only needed time to grow heavier. The conversation began politely, almost gently, framed as routine, framed as closure, framed as a chance to help put something to rest. He nodded along, offered coffee, sat down at a table that had seen decades of ordinary mornings. His voice was steady at first, his story familiar. He repeated the same movements, the same alibis, the same distances he had traveled that year, details polished smooth by repetition. But this time the questions didn't slide off. They pressed. They lingered. They returned from different angles, not confrontational, just persistent, like water testing stone. When the evidence was introduced, not as accusation but as fact, the room changed temperature. A photograph placed gently on the table. A document slid across the surface. A pause long enough to let comprehension arrive on its own. His eyes dropped. His breathing shifted. The cadence of his answers altered in ways no script could hide. He corrected himself mid-sentence. He asked for clarification he didn't need. He laughed once, briefly, at nothing. Investigators didn't interrupt. Silence did more work than words ever could. It stretched. It tightened. It forced choices. And in that quiet, something surfaced that hadn't appeared in any previous interview, not in 1980, not in the decade that followed. A name, not a suspect, not yet, just a person he'd known, a person who'd been around more than he had admitted, a person who had access, motive, and proximity in a way that suddenly aligned with the tiny clue that had reopened the case. That name sent a ripple through the task force. Files were pulled again, this time with a new focal point. The person existed in the margins of the old investigation. Mentioned once, maybe twice, never elevated, never pursued. Back then, there hadn't been enough to justify it. Now there was context. There was pattern. There was a reason to look harder. The past, once flat and exhausted, began to take on depth. They traced movements, employment records, residences, social ties. The picture that emerged wasn't cinematic. It was mundane, almost disappointing in its normalcy, which made it more unsettling. This was someone who blended, someone who attended barbecues, who showed up to work on time, who had no record that screamed danger, someone who, in 1980, had experienced a disruption, a period of instability that coincided too neatly with a crime to ignore. When approached, the second interview unfolded differently. No hospitality, no coffee, just distance. He was defensive from the start, his tone sharp, his patience thin. He denied knowing the victim well, denied being near the scene, denied almost everything with an intensity that felt rehearsed, not remembered. Investigators noted the tells, but didn't press yet. They needed more. They needed the case to speak louder than any confession. That voice came from the lab. Advancements that had been science fiction in 1980 were now routine. And a tiny clue that had reignited everything underwent its most comprehensive analysis yet. The results took time. Weeks passed with no updates, the waiting itself becoming a kind of pressure test. When the call finally came, it wasn't celebratory. It was careful. It was precise. It was devastating in its simplicity. The material matched, not perfectly, not absolutely, but within a margin so narrow it might as well have been a fingerprint pressed across 4 decades. It tied the evidence to the second man in a way that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence or contamination. The room where the results were delivered was silent for a long moment. Every person present understanding exactly what this meant and exactly how fragile the moment was. They moved quickly after that, but not recklessly. Warrants were prepared with meticulous detail. Every step documented. Every assumption justified. The goal wasn't speed. It was permanence. They searched spaces that had been private for years, attics and garages and storage units, filled with the sediment of a lifetime. Most of it was irrelevant. Old furniture, old clothes, old photographs. But buried among the ordinary were objects that raised questions no one could answer away. A tool that matched marks long considered unidentifiable. A notebook with dates that aligned too well. A receipt from a location the suspect had sworn he'd never visited. Each item alone was explainable. Together, they formed a constellation that pointed unmistakably toward the center of the storm. The case, once defined by absence, was now crowded with presence. News of the development spread fast, faster than anyone wanted. Media trucks returned to streets that had forgotten their weight. Cameras pointed at houses that had never expected attention. The community reacted in waves, shock followed by anger, anger followed by a kind of grim validation. People who had lived with the uncertainty for 40 years felt something shift, not relief yet, but recognition. The truth was close enough now to cast a shadow. The arrest came quietly, without spectacle. No chase, no resistance. Just a door opened, hands cuffed, a life redirected into narrow corridors of accountability. As he was led away, he didn't look at the cameras. He looked straight ahead, jaw set, expression unreadable. He said nothing. Silence, once his shield, became his prison. In the hours that followed, the task force gathered not to celebrate, but to breathe. The weight they had carried pressed down all at once, exhaustion mixing with a restrained sense of purpose fulfilled. This wasn't the end. They knew that. Trials still loomed. Defenses would be mounted. Doubt would be seated. But the arc of the case had changed forever. The mystery that had haunted Arkansas since 1980 was no longer abstract. It had a name, a face, a path. And as the night settled in and the evidence was locked away once more, not as forgotten relics, but as instruments of truth, the realization spread quietly through everyone involved. A single, overlooked detail had survived 4 decades of darkness, waiting for the moment someone finally learned how to listen. The cell door closed with sound that didn't echo so much as settle, a dull finality that seemed to absorb the air around it. And for the first time since 1980, the case stopped being an idea and became a living, breathing confrontation between past and present. The man sat alone on the narrow bench, hands folded, eyes fixed on a point no one else could see, while down the hall fluorescent lights hummed and paperwork shuffled, and a process that had taken 40 years began to move with unnerving speed. Outside, the town absorbed the news in fragments, through radios and televisions and phones lighting up in pockets. Each alert another tremor running through a community that had grown accustomed to carrying this weight without answers. Investigators returned to the timeline with fresh eyes, not to confirm what they believed, but to challenge it, to attack it from every possible angle the defense might later use. They walked the sequence minute by minute, revisiting movements once dismissed as irrelevant, conversations that had seemed too small to matter, places that had blended into the background. What emerged wasn't a single explosive revelation, but a tightening web, threads pulling closer together until there was no space left for coincidence to hide. Witnesses who had spoken decades earlier were contacted again, their memories fragile but not useless. Some had forgotten faces, but not feelings. Some remembered the way a room had gone quiet when the suspect entered, the way conversation stalled, the way the air seemed to thicken. Others recalled seeing him where he insisted he had never been. Not with clarity, but with confidence born of repetition, the kind of memory reinforced by telling the story over and over as a cautionary tale, even when no one asked for it. The defense began building its wall almost immediately, pushing back through statements and legal filings, questioning the reliability of evidence that had slept for decades, hinting at contamination, misinterpretation, technological overreach. It was expected. It was necessary. The system demanded friction, demanded doubt, but the case no longer relied on a single piece of proof. It breathed through accumulation, through alignment, through the uncomfortable way too many details leaned in the same direction. Behind closed doors, prosecutors debated strategy with the intensity of people who understood what failure would mean, not just legally, but symbolically. A cold case collapse after 40 years wouldn't simply free a man. It would reopen wounds that had only just begun to close. They chose patience over drama, clarity over shock, a narrative that didn't need embellishment because the truth laid bare carried its own weight. As preparations continued, the victim's family was brought into the circle, informed not through headlines but through measured conversation, faces across tables, voices careful and human. Their reactions defied expectation. There was no shouting, no collapse, no cinematic release. Just a long, silent moment as the words landed, followed by a nod that held grief, anger, relief, and disbelief in equal measure. For them, the arrest didn't end the story. It cracked it open, forcing them to revisit memories they had learned to survive by keeping sealed. They returned to places they hadn't visited in years. Old neighborhoods, old roads, spaces where absence had become a permanent fixture. This time, though, the absence had context. It had direction. It pointed somewhere instead of nowhere, and that alone altered the texture of their grief, reshaping it into something heavier, but also something grounded. The suspect, meanwhile, maintained his silence. Interviews were declined. Offers to explain were left unanswered. His attorneys spoke for him. Every word chosen with surgical care. Every sentence designed to create space between him and the narrative forming around his name. In the absence of denial from the man himself, speculation filled the gap, rumors blooming unchecked, some grotesque, some oddly sympathetic, all of them incomplete. Investigators resisted the noise, focusing instead on corroboration. They revisited physical evidence once more, not because they doubted it, but because they wanted redundancy. If one pillar cracked, another would stand. They tested again. They measured again. They invited independent experts to review findings without context, letting science speak without persuasion. Each report returned with the same conclusion, phrased differently, but unmistakable in meaning. The past, it turned out, had been patient. One afternoon, as files were being organized for trial, an analyst noticed something that had been overlooked not once, but multiple times, a minor discrepancy in a statement given in 1980 that didn't match later versions. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't incriminating on its own. But when placed alongside newer evidence, it suggested something else entirely. A moment of improvisation, a detail invented under pressure and then adjusted over time as memory hardened into narrative. It was the kind of thing only visible when you already knew where to look. That discrepancy became a quiet focal point, a pressure point that prosecutors planned to apply gently but persistently, not as a trap, but as an invitation to explain. People who tell the truth don't usually need to revise it. People who lie do, even when they're good at it. As the trial date approached, the town transformed. Conversations shifted from speculation to logistics, court schedules, parking restrictions, security plans. The machinery of justice rolled forward, indifferent to emotion, relentless in its demand for order. Yet beneath that order, tension coiled. Everyone sensed that something irreversible was about to happen, that whatever the outcome, the case would no longer belong to rumor or memory. On the first day in court, the room filled slowly, deliberately. The victim's family sat together, not touching, but close enough to feel each other's presence. The defendant entered without ceremony, eyes forward, expression neutral, as if the weight of 40 years had compressed into a single moment of control. When the charges were read aloud, they hung in the air longer than expected, each word landing with the force of accumulated time. Opening statements were restrained, almost understated. No theatrics, no grand declarations, just a promise to show how a tiny piece of evidence, ignored and misunderstood, had survived long enough to tell its story when the world was finally ready to hear it. The defense responded with caution, urging the jury to remember the distance between suspicion and proof, between probability and certainty. As testimony began, the past unfolded not as a straight line, but as overlapping echoes, voices from different eras converging in a single space. The jury listened. The room held its breath. And somewhere between the exhibits and the questions, between the data and the memories, the truth began to take shape, not as a revelation, but as an inevitability. Outside, the sun set behind the courthouse, casting long shadows across the steps, shadows that stretched backward through decades, touching a night in 1980 when everything had gone quiet and a mystery had been born. Inside, under the unblinking lights, that mystery was finally being forced to speak, and everyone knew there was no turning back now. The courtroom air thickened as the first witnesses took the stand, not with drama, but with the weight of expectation, the kind that presses down slowly until even breathing feels deliberate. Each sworn oath felt heavier than the last, as if the room itself remembered how long it had waited for these words. The prosecutor's voice stayed calm, measured, almost quiet, drawing the jury in not with volume but with precision, laying the foundation brick by brick, trusting the structure to hold. An evidence technician described the box where the crucial item had slept for decades, sealed, labeled, forgotten by all but a few. The jurors leaned forward as photographs appeared on the screen, grainy and unassuming, the kind of images no one would have noticed without context. The technician spoke about temperature control, about protocols followed even when the case went cold, about hands that never touched what they weren't meant to touch. It wasn't exciting testimony. It wasn't meant to be. It was reassurance. It was proof that time had not erased responsibility. Then came the forensic analyst, a quiet figure with a steady cadence, explaining how science had changed while the evidence had remained the same. Words like markers, probability, and statistical certainty floated into the room, technical but unavoidable. The analyst didn't point at the defendant, didn't raise their voice. They simply explained that the chance of the DNA belonging to anyone else was so small it bordered on the theoretical, a number so distant it felt almost abstract. The jury scribbled notes. The defense shifted in their seats. Cross-examination came sharp and fast, a calculated attempt to destabilize certainty. Questions about lab error, about contamination, about the impossibility of perfection. The analyst answered each one without flinching, acknowledging margins of error, while emphasizing their insignificance. It was a dance both sides knew well, but the rhythm favored the data. Facts didn't argue back. They simply waited. When the first witness from the past was called, the room changed. This wasn't science. This was memory, fragile and stubborn, shaped by time and emotion. The witness spoke slowly, carefully, eyes sometimes drifting as if searching for images stored too deep for easy retrieval. They didn't claim clarity. They admitted doubt, but they remembered the feeling, the unease, the moment something felt wrong. The prosecutor didn't interrupt, didn't rush. Let silence do its work. The defense pounced on inconsistencies, highlighting gaps, pressing on contradictions between old statements and new recollections. The witness didn't resist. They acknowledged change, admitted uncertainty, explained how memory fades, but impressions linger. And in that honesty, something unexpected happened. The jury listened more closely. Perfect memory sounded rehearsed. Imperfect memory sounded human. As more witnesses followed, a pattern emerged, subtle but undeniable. Different voices, different lives, different reasons for remembering, all pointing in the same direction without ever coordinating their stories. No single testimony was devastating on its own. Together, they formed a current, pulling steadily toward conclusion no one wanted to say aloud too soon. The defense introduced its own witnesses, experts who spoke of cognitive bias, of the danger of retrofitting evidence to match conclusions, of how cold cases could seduce investigators into seeing patterns where none existed. Their arguments were sharp, intellectually sound, and necessary. Doubt had to be given room to breathe. But doubt alone couldn't erase alignment. As days passed, the courtroom rhythm settled into something almost ritualistic. Morning arrivals, afternoon recesses, the same faces, the same seats, the same tension hovering just beneath the surface. Outside, reporters tracked every development, headlines flashing fragments of testimony into the public consciousness, each one sparking debate, speculation, and renewed interest in a story many had assumed would never end. Inside, the defendant remained still, inscrutable, occasionally leaning toward his attorney, whispering something too quiet to hear. There were no outbursts, no visible cracks. Just a man watching his past unfold without commentary. Some jurors studied him when they thought no one noticed, searching for signs, for reactions, for anything that might bridge the gap between evidence and emotion. They found little. Midway through the trial, the prosecution introduced a long-lost piece of evidence that had triggered everything. It was displayed carefully, almost reverently, as if acknowledging the journey it had taken to reach this moment. The prosecutor didn't dramatize it, didn't oversell it. They let its simplicity speak. A tiny detail, a trace overlooked, a fragment dismissed as irrelevant until technology caught up with truth. The defense objected, argued relevance, questioned interpretation. The judge listened, considered, then allowed it. The jury watched as the explanation unfolded, connecting the fragment to the larger picture, showing how it fit not by force, but by design. It was a kind of moment that didn't provoke gasps or whispers, just a quiet recalibration, a subtle shift in understanding that felt irreversible. As closing arguments approached, fatigue set in, not just physical but emotional. Everyone in the room carried the weight of what was at stake. For the family, it was a possibility of resolution tempered by the fear of disappointment. For the defendant, it was freedom balanced against accountability. For the jurors, it was a burden of deciding not just guilt, but meaning, of determining whether the past could finally be given a name and a shape. The prosecutor closed without flourish, reminding the jury that time doesn't erase truth. it only tests it. That evidence doesn't need to shout to be heard. That justice delayed is not justice denied if it arrives intact. The defense followed with a warning, urging caution, restraint, reminding them that certainty must be earned, not assumed, that the consequences of error were permanent. When the jury was dismissed as deliberate, the courtroom exhaled for the first time in weeks. Conversations hushed. Eyes followed the jurors as they filed out, carrying decades of unanswered questions into a room where no cameras waited, where only discussion and doubt and conscience would decide what happened next. Night fell again over the courthouse, lights glowing against the dark, a beacon of process and patience. Somewhere inside, 12 people began to talk, to argue, to weigh science against memory, probability against doubt, the past against the present. And with every passing hour, the silence that had defined this case for 40 years grew thinner, stretched to the breaking point, as the truth pressed closer to the surface, ready to emerge whether anyone was prepared for it or not. Deliberations didn't begin with raised voices or dramatic declarations. They started with chairs scraping softly against the floor, notebooks opening, a long pause where no one wanted to be first to speak. The room was smaller than the courtroom. Stripped of ceremony, fluorescent lights humming faintly above a table scarred by decades of decisions. On the wall, a clock ticked with quiet insistence, each second a reminder that time, once again, was being measured in this case. When the foreperson finally broke the silence, it wasn't an opinion, just a question. Where do we start? It sounded simple, almost naive, but it unlocked everything. One juror suggested the DNA. Another said the witnesses. Someone else said motive or the absence of it. The case sprawled across the table in pieces, waiting to be assembled by 12 strangers who now held its fate. They moved slowly at first, cautious, respectful, as if afraid that pushing too hard might shatter something fragile. The forensic evidence came up again and again, its clarity both comforting and unsettling. Numbers were repeated, probabilities rephrased. Someone admitted they didn't fully understand the science, only that it felt solid, immovable. Another juror pushed back, reminding the group that even solid things can be misinterpreted if you don't know what you're looking at. Memory became the battleground. How much weight should be given to recollections dragged across decades? One juror spoke about their own childhood, how certain moments felt vivid until someone else remembered them differently. Another countered that some memories don't fade. They calcify, shaped by emotion rather than detail. The room grew warmer as voices overlapped, not in anger, but in urgency, each person trying to reconcile logic with intuition. Hours passed. Coffee cups emptied. Notes were shuffled and reshuffled. They asked to review testimony, then asked again. Transcripts were read aloud, passages highlighted, phrases dissected. A single sentence from a witness sparked 20 minutes of debate, not about what was said, but about what it meant. Intent versus interpretation. Observation versus assumption. The same words, heard through 12 different lives. Outside the jury room, the building settled into nighttime stillness. Cleaning crews moved quietly through hallways. Security guards made their rounds, nodding to reporters still camped near the entrance, waiting for any sign, any hint of progress. Phones buzzed with speculation, with theories dressed up as certainty, with arguments playing out in comment sections far removed from the gravity of the room upstairs. Back inside, fatigue sharpened perspectives instead of dulling them. One juror admitted they had come in skeptical, wary of cold cases and the stories built around them. Another confessed they had assumed guilt early, swayed by the sheer volume of alignment. These admissions shifted the tone. It wasn't about winning an argument anymore. It was about honesty, about acknowledging bias and trying imperfectly to set it aside. The long-lost evidence returned to the center of the table, not physically, but conceptually. Why had it been overlooked? Was that negligence or inevitability? Did its absence for so long weaken its impact, or did its survival strengthen it? Someone pointed out that the evidence hadn't changed. Only the tools had. Another wondered aloud whether justice should depend on technology catching up to truth. Late into the night, they took a vote. Not a final one, just a temperature check, a way to see where everyone stood. The results were mixed, not evenly, but not decisively. Enough uncertainty remained to keep the discussion alive. No one seemed surprised. They ordered food, ate quietly, returned to the table. One juror, previously reserved, spoke up with unexpected clarity. They talked about patterns, not in the evidence, but in the timeline, about how small decisions compound. How being in the wrong place at the wrong time doesn't make you guilty, but being in every wrong place, at every critical moment, starts to mean something. The room listened, not because it was persuasive, but because it connected disparate pieces into a narrative that felt cohesive. Another juror responded by grounding the conversation again. Stories are powerful, they said, but stories can mislead. Evidence doesn't care about narrative. It either fits or it doesn't. They pointed back to the defense's warnings, to the danger of filling gaps with assumptions. The balance shifted again, like a pendulum refusing to settle. As dawn approached, they agreed to rest. The judge allowed it, understanding that clarity rarely comes from exhaustion. The jurors filed out quietly, each carrying their thoughts home, replaying arguments in their minds, wondering what detail they might have missed, what question they should have asked. Morning brought a different energy. Sunlight filtered through the windows, harsh and revealing. Coffee was stronger, voices steadier. They resumed with renewed focus, revisiting the case in the beginning, this time faster, more confident, stripping away redundancies, zeroing in on what truly mattered. The DNA evidence held. No amount of debate loosened its grip. The witnesses, flawed as they were, aligned in ways that felt organic, not rehearsed. The defense's alternative explanations were considered again, weighed carefully, but they required too many coincidences, too many leaps. Doubt remained, but it narrowed, compressed into something manageable. When the four-person call for another vote, the silence felt different. This time, the result leaned heavily in one direction. Not unanimous yet, but close. The remaining holdout spoke, not defiantly, but thoughtfully, explaining what still troubled them. The group listened, addressed each concern one by one, not dismissing them, but testing them against the evidence already accepted. One by one, those concerns weakened, not because of pressure, but because answers emerged. Not perfect answers, sufficient ones, the kind the law demands, even when the heart hesitates. When the final vote was taken, it was unanimous. The room didn't erupt. There was no celebration, just a quiet, collective understanding that something irreversible had just occurred. The four-person knocked. The bailiff opened the door. The jurors filed back into the courtroom, faces composed, expressions guarded. Everyone stood as they entered, a ritual repeated countless times, but never meaningless. The defendant looked up, searching faces, perhaps hoping for crack, a sign of mercy, a hint of doubt. He found none. The judge asked a question that had been hanging in the air for decades. The four-person answered, voice steady, hands trembling slightly despite the effort to keep them still. The verdict landed without sound, but its impact rippled through the room. A sharp intake of breath from the gallery, a whispered prayer, the scrape of a chair. The defendant's shoulders sagged, just barely, a movement so small it might have gone unnoticed if the room weren't so attuned to every shift. His attorney placed a hand on his arm, whispered something meant to comfort or prepare. It was impossible to tell. Across the aisle, family members clutched each other, tears falling not in triumph, but in release. The judge thanked the jury, dismissed them, reminded them of the service they had provided, words that felt both profound and insufficient. As the room emptied, the weight didn't lift. It transformed. What had been uncertainty became consequence. What had been silence became aftermath. Outside, cameras flashed. Microphones extended. Questions shouted into the air. The headlines were already writing themselves, bold and declarative. But inside the courthouse, in the quiet moments between footsteps, the truth felt more complex. A case closed, yes, a mystery solved, but resolution carried its own kind of ache. Because even now, with a verdict spoken and recorded, the past remained unchanged. The loss still happened. The years still passed. And somewhere in the space between justice and memory, the echo of the crime lingered, reminding everyone involved that some truths, once uncovered, don't bring peace so much as they demand to be lived with. The courthouse emptied slowly, as if the building itself needed time to absorb what had just happened. Footsteps echoed down marble corridors, then faded into the parking lot, where morning had fully claimed the sky. News vans idle with engines humming, satellite dishes angled upward like metal ears, already transmitting the verdict to a waiting world. Inside, the air still felt charged, heavy with words that could not be taken back. For the families, the verdict did not arrive as an ending. It arrived as a collision. Grief slammed into relief. Vindication tangled with exhaustion. Some cried openly. Others stared straight ahead, faces frozen in a private reckoning that cameras would never capture. Decades of waiting do not dissolve simply because a jury speaks. They settle differently, rearranging the shape of pain without erasing it. The defendant was led away through a side door, cuffs clicking softly, a sound too small for the weight it carried. He did not resist. He did not look back. Years earlier, he had walked out of this courthouse untouched, unnamed, invisible. Now every step felt documented, cataloged, transformed into a symbol of something larger than the man himself. Justice, delayed and finally delivered, moving at the speed of a slow procession. Outside, reporters filled the silence with noise. Questions flew. How does it feel? Do you feel closure? Did you ever lose hope? The answers came haltingly, if at all. Some family members declined to speak, shielding themselves behind attorneys and friends. Others stepped forward, voices trembling but resolute, repeating a single message in different forms. We never forgot. We never stopped waiting. We never stopped believing the truth would surface. Behind the scenes, investigators watched from a distance, their expressions unreadable. For them, the verdict was validation, but also indictment. Proof that persistence mattered, yes, but also a reminder of what had been missed, overlooked, set aside. They spoke quietly among themselves about the evidence, the turning point, the moment when the past cracked open just enough to let the truth through. Pride mingled with regret in equal measure. The long-lost evidence, now the centerpiece of the case, was already being discussed in professional circles. How many other files sat dormant, their answers locked inside envelopes and boxes labeled with dates that felt impossibly old? How many cases were waiting for a similar breakthrough, a similar stroke of technological timing? The Arkansas verdict did not just close one case. It reopened 1,000 questions. In the days that followed, the story spread beyond local headlines. National outlets picked it up, framing it as a triumph of modern forensics, a warning to those who believe time erases guilt. Commentators debated the implications. Defense attorneys warned about over-reliance on new science applied to old evidence. Prosecutors countered that truth does not expire. Social media turned the case into a battlefield of opinion, certainty declared with alarming confidence by people far removed from the courtroom. Yet amid the noise, quieter moments unfolded. In a small house not far from where the crime had occurred, an aging parent sat alone at a kitchen table, photographs spread out like relics. A life paused mid-sentence, a smile captured before everything changed. The verdict did not bring that life back. It did not restore the years stolen by unanswered questions. It simply confirmed what had long been suspected, transforming belief into record. At the police department, the cold case unit felt different now. The solved file was removed from the shelf, its spine worn from handling, replaced by an empty space that felt both satisfying and unsettling. Detectives gathered, some who worked the case for years, others who had inherited it without knowing if they would ever see it end. There was no celebration, no champagne, just a quiet acknowledgement that this one, at least, was no longer whispering from the shadows. Sentencing loomed, another chapter yet to be written. Legal motions followed the verdict like aftershocks, predictable and procedural. Appeals were discussed, strategies outlined. The defense prepared its next steps, arguing points of law rather than fact now, searching for cracks in the process rather than the story. The prosecution responded methodically, aware that a conviction is never truly final until every challenge has been met. For the community, the case resurfaced memories long buried. People who had lived through the original crime remembered where they were when they first heard the news, how fear had crept into daily routines, how suspicion had altered the way neighbors looked at one another. Younger residents learned the story for the first time, discovering that the quiet streets they walked every day carried a history darker than they had imagined. Some returned to the original crime scene, now altered by time and development. A vacant lot where a house once stood, a tree grown tall where police tape had fluttered in the wind. The geography of violence rarely stays the same, but the emotional landscape remains, layered beneath new paint and fresh asphalt. Standing there, it was impossible not to feel the echo of what had happened, the sense that the ground itself remembered. The victim's name was spoken more frequently now, no longer confined to case files and anniversaries. It appeared in articles, interviews, memorial posts shared by people who had never known them but felt compelled to acknowledge the life at the center of the storm. There was comfort in that recognition, in the idea that the person lost was not reduced to evidence or testimony, but remembered as someone who had existed beyond the crime. As weeks turned into months, the intensity of coverage faded, replaced by newer stories, fresher tragedies. But for those closest to the case, time moved differently. The verdict did not close a door so much as it opened another, one leading into a future shaped by what had finally been confirmed. Therapy appointments were scheduled. Conversations postponed for decades finally took place. Anger surfaced where numbness had lived before. In interviews given after the fact, jurors spoke carefully about their experience. They described the weight of responsibility, the sleepless nights, the moment they realized their decision would ripple outward in ways they could not control. Some admitted they still thought about the case, replaying arguments in their minds, wondering if they had truly done the right thing. The law demands certainty, but humanity rarely provides it without residue. The case became a reference point, cited in seminars and conferences as an example of perseverance, of the dangers and possibilities inherent in reopening the past. Slides showed timelines stretching across decades, photographs fading from crisp black and white to yellow blur. Speakers emphasized the importance of preserving evidence, of documenting every detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem, because sometimes it is the smallest thing that changes everything. And yet, despite the conviction, despite the narrative of resolution, an unease lingered. Not doubt about guilt, but awareness of fragility. The knowledge that justice, even when achieved, is imperfect. That answers do not erase loss. That closure is a word often used by people who do not have to live with the consequences. Late one evening, long after the courthouse lights had dimmed, a single office remained illuminated in the police department. Inside, a detective sat alone, reviewing another file, another cold case waiting its turn. The solved case rested nearby, closed but not forgotten, a reminder of what was possible and how long it could take. Outside, the city slept, unaware of the quiet determination unfolding behind those walls. The Arkansas case had crossed a threshold, moving from mystery to memory, from question to conclusion, but its impact continued to ripple outward, touching lives, reshaping assumptions, challenging belief that time always wins. In that sense, the story was not over. It had simply changed form, leaving behind a truth that would endure, heavy and undeniable, long after the headlines moved on. Time did not rush forward after the verdict. It crept. It lingered in doorways and hallways, in the spaces between phone calls and sleepless nights. The community learned to live a new reality, one where the unanswered question that had hovered for decades was finally pinned to a name, a face, a sentence waiting to be imposed. The silence that followed was not peace. It was adjustment. In living rooms across the county, televisions replayed the same footage on a loop. The defendant entering the courthouse. The jury foreperson standing, voice steady, delivering words that had been rehearsed in private fear. Viewers leaned closer, searching for something in his expression, some flicker that might explain everything. They found nothing conclusive. They never do. The families retrieved from the public eye. But the case followed them home. Mail arrived in thick envelopes, letters from strangers offering condolences, congratulations, opinions no one had asked for. Some messages were kind, handwritten with care. Others were sharp, accusatory, convinced of alternative theories, clinging to doubt like a lifeline. Grief does not come with instructions for how to filter the world. Sentencing day approached, heavy with expectation. It carried a different weight than the trial, less about truth and more about consequence. The courtroom filled again, though the energy had shifted. This was no longer a battle of narratives. It was a reckoning. The judge listened as attorneys spoke in measured tones, arguing years, months, numbers that attempted to quantify harm that could never be fully measured. Victim impact statements followed, each one a fracture in the air. Voices cracked. Hands shook. Words stumbled out in fragments, stitched together by resolve. They spoke of birthdays missed, of empty chairs at holiday tables, of how time had not healed but sharpened the absence. Some addressed the defendant directly. Others stared at the wall behind him, unwilling to grant even a glance. The defendant declined to speak. His attorney offered a brief statement, formal, restrained, emphasizing age, health, the length of time already passed. It sounded hollow in the room, swallowed by the gravity of what had been lost. The judge nodded, expression unreadable, and took the matter under advisement. Even now, the law moved deliberately, refusing to hurry. Outside, the courthouse steps became a stage again. Microphones clustered, cameras clicked. Reporters summarized what had been said inside, reducing hours of motion to sound bites and headlines. The families passed through the crowd with heads down, guided by familiar hands. For them, every public appearance felt like reopening a wound for strangers to examine. As the date for sentencing drew closer, the story continued to evolve in unexpected ways. Old acquaintances of the defendant surfaced, some offering character references, others recounting moments that now felt ominous in hindsight. A former co-worker remembered an offhand comment made years ago, insignificant at the time, now scrutinized for meaning. Memory, once unlocked, became unreliable and relentless. The investigation itself underwent a quiet post-mortem. Internal reviews examined early missteps, decisions influenced by limited technology and human bias. Files were reread with modern eyes. Questions were asked that no one had thought to ask before. Could this have been solved sooner? Should it have been? The answers were complex, uncomfortable, and rarely definitive. Young detectives listened closely, absorbing lessons etched in regret and perseverance. They were reminded that every case, no matter how cold, carries the possibility of revival. That evidence must be treated like a message to the future, preserved with the understanding that tomorrow's tools may see what today's cannot. The Arkansas case became a cautionary tale and a beacon at the same time. Meanwhile, the place where the crime had occurred continued its quiet existence. Cars passed, birds nested, seasons changed without regard for human memory. Yet for those who knew, the location felt different now, charged with clarity that had been absent before. The mystery that once clung to like fog had lifted, revealing a landscape still scarred but no longer obscured. In private moments, family members grappled with unexpected emotions. Anger flared, not just at the perpetrator, but at time itself, at the years spent in limbo. Guilt surfaced too, irrational but persistent, questioning moments of laughter or relief as if they were betrayals of the past. Healing, they learned, is not a straight line but a series of collisions. The broader public began to move on, attention drifting toward the next breaking story, the next unresolved case promising fresh intrigue. Yet echoes remained. Online forums archived the discussion. Podcasts dissected the timeline, the evidence, the turning point that changed everything. Listeners debated theories late into the night, engaging with the case as an intellectual exercise, far removed from its human cost. As sentencing day finally arrived, the courtroom filled one last time. The judge spoke at length, acknowledging the pain endured, the years lost, the significance of holding someone accountable no matter how much time had passed. The sentence was delivered calmly, firmly, a conclusion rendered in legal language that felt almost inadequate for the moment it represented. Reactions were subdued. No cheers, no gasps, just a collective exhale, as if everyone present had been holding their breath for decades without realizing it. The defendant was led away again, this time toward a future defined by confinement. The families remained seated for a moment longer, absorbing the finality of it all. Outside, the sky was overcast, a flat gray that mirrored the mood. Interviews were brief. Statements were short. There was nothing left to explain. Justice had taken its time, but it had arrived, carrying with it both solace and sorrow. The case was officially closed, its file stamped and shelved, but its imprint lingered everywhere. That night, lights went out across the town one by one. In quiet bedrooms, people lay awake, thinking about how close the past can feel, even when it stretches back 40 years. Somewhere, another cold case waited in the dark, its truth still hidden, its ending unwritten. And the lesson of Arkansas settled in, heavy and undeniable. Time does not erase what happened. It only waits. Morning came without ceremony. No sirens. No breaking alerts. Just daylight slipping through curtains, illuminating a town that had carried a secret for 4 decades and now had to learn how to live without it. The case was closed on paper, but closure is not a switch that flips. It is a process. Slow, uneven, sometimes brutal in its honesty. In kitchens and diners, conversations circled back to the same question. What now? People had organized their memories around the absence of an answer, and suddenly that absence was gone. The story that once lived in speculation had hardened into fact. Some found comfort in that solidity. Others felt strangely untethered, as if the mystery had been a grim companion they no longer knew how to release. The courthouse stood quiet again, its steps empty, its doors locked until the next case demanded attention. Inside, the courtroom where history had finally caught up with the past sat unused, dust settling on benches that had absorbed years of whispered fear and restrained hope. Justice had spoken there, but the echoes lingered, refusing to fade completely. For the investigators, the adrenaline drained away, leaving reflection in its wake. They returned to routine work, but nothing felt routine anymore. Every evidence bag seemed heavier. Every old file looked like it might be hiding something vital in plain sight. The Arkansas case had rewired their instincts, taught them that the smallest overlooked detail could one day roar back to life. One detective, nearing retirement, visited the evidence room late one evening. He stood in front of shelves stacked with boxes, each labeled with dates and names most people had forgotten. He understood now that these boxes were not relics. They were promises. Promises that time alone did not decide the fate of truth. The families faced quieter challenges. Without court dates to prepare for, without lawyers to call, without cameras to avoid, they were left alone with something they had not felt in years. Space. Space to remember without strategizing. Space to grieve without explaining. Some welcomed it. Others found it suffocating. There were moments of unexpected clarity. A photograph rediscovered in a drawer. A story shared that no longer had to be told in hushed tones. Laughter surfaced, tentative at first, then steadier, carrying a trace of guilt that slowly loosened its grip. Life, stubborn and relentless, insisted on continuing. The victim's name appeared one last time in a local paper, not as a headline, but as part of a longer reflection on the case's impact. It spoke of resilience, of patience, of how a community learned, too late, but not too late enough, the cost of ignoring the quiet details. The article was folded, saved, and placed where it could be found again. Elsewhere, the convicted man adjusted to confinement. The world shrank to concrete and schedules, to doors that opened and closed at someone else's command. His name faded from conversation, replaced by broader discussions about cold cases, forensic breakthroughs, and the unsettling idea that no one is ever truly out of reach of their past. Across the state, law enforcement agencies revisited their own unsolved cases with renewed urgency. Evidence rooms were reopened, old tapes digitized, new technology applied to material once considered exhausted. The ripple effect spread, quiet but determined, driven by the knowledge that Arkansas had waited 40 years and still found its answer. At night, the town settled into a different kind of silence, not the heavy, questioning quiet that had dominated for decades, but something more reflective. The mystery no longer pressed against the edges of sleep. Instead, it lay resolved, heavy but contained, like a chapter finally finished. And yet, even with the truth exposed, something intangible remained, a reminder etched into the collective memory. That evil does not always announce itself. That justice can be delayed but not necessarily denied. That time is neither an ally nor an enemy. It is simply the medium through which consequences eventually travel. The Arkansas case had ended, but its shadows stretched long, touching other stories, other lives, other unanswered questions waiting patiently in the dark. And somewhere, in a file not yet reopened, another truth waited for the moment someone would finally notice what had been there all along. The weeks that followed slipped into months, and the case began to change shape in the collective memory. What once felt raw and immediate started to settle into something denser, heavier, like sediment at the bottom of a river. People no longer spoke about it every day, but when they did, their voices dropped instinctively, as if the story itself demanded respect. The town carried on, but not unchanged. Certain places acquired new meaning. A stretch of road where nothing appeared remarkable now felt watched, remembered. A building that had always blended into background seemed to hold on to a presence, subtle but undeniable. History had passed through here, and it had left fingerprints no one could quite scrub away. For the families, grief evolved again, not into something smaller, but into something different. The sharp edges dulled, replaced by an ache that was easier to carry but harder to ignore. They began to mark time not by the anniversary of the crime, but by quieter milestones. The first holiday without court proceedings. The first birthday without reporters calling. The first year where the future did not feel like a legal calendar. Some sought counseling. Others turned inward. A few chose to speak publicly, attending forums and panels about cold cases, lending their voices to conversations they once avoided. They talked about patience, about resilience, about the strange way hope can survive decades of disappointment without losing its shape. Law enforcement continued to feel the aftershocks. Training sessions referenced the case without dramatics, just facts and lessons. Preserve everything. Question assumptions. Revisit what feels settled. Younger officers listened closely, aware that they might one day be the ones reopening a box sealed long before they joined the force. Technology kept moving forward, indifferent to human timelines. New methods emerged, promising deeper insight from smaller traces. Analysts speculated about what might be possible in another 10, 20 years. The Arkansas case became a benchmark, proof that evidence does not expire, only our ability to read it changes. In quieter moments, investigators reflected on the human cost of delay. They thought about how many lives had unfolded under the weight of uncertainty, how different those lives might have been if answers had come sooner. These thoughts did not lead to blame so much as resolve, a quiet vow to do better with what time remained. The convicted man's appeals were filed, procedural and expected. Legal language replaced emotional testimony. Motions cited precedent and technicality. The process was methodical, slow, almost attached. But even as the system churned, the core truth remained untouched, anchored by evidence that time had only strengthened. Public interest flared briefly with each new filing, then faded again. The story no longer belonged to the headlines. It lived instead in memory, in policy changes, in conversations between detectives late at night, in families who had learned that justice can arrive long after innocence has been buried. On an unremarkable afternoon, a memorial was quietly updated. No ceremony, no crowd, just a new plaque, clean and simple, acknowledging resolution without pretending it erased loss. Someone left flowers. Someone else stood back and watched, hands in pockets, breathing slowly, letting the moment pass. Life continued its steady rhythm. Children who had not been born when the crime occurred now walked the same streets, unaware of the history beneath their feet. And that, in a way, felt like progress, not forgetting, but allowing the future to exist without being entirely shaped by the past. Still, when the wind was right, when the light hit just so, the story resurfaced. A reminder that answers, once found, do not end a story. They transform it. They turn questions into consequences, mysteries into memories, and silence into something that finally, mercifully, knows what it is holding. The Arkansas case had reached its conclusion, but its presence endured, woven into the fabric of the place it had scarred. A quiet testament to the idea that even after 40 years, truth can surface, and when it does, it leaves nothing untouched. Time did what it always does. It moved forward without asking permission, carrying the weight of the solved case into corners no one expected. The story stopped being about the crime itself and became something broader, more unsettling. It became about time, about endurance, about the long shadow cast by a single moment of violence, and how far that shadow can stretch before the light finally catches up. In quiet offices across the state, boxes were open that had not been touched in years. Not because of a directive, not because of public pressure, but because belief had shifted. Investigators who once assumed some answers were gone forever now understood that permanence was an illusion. Evidence slept. It did not die. And that realization changed everything. The Arkansas case was cited in internal memos, not with reverence, but with urgency. A reminder that complacency is a choice. That unresolved does not mean unsolvable. That the difference between a cold case and a closed one can be as small as a detail overlooked during a long night decades earlier. For the families, attention gradually receded, leaving space for something unfamiliar, normalcy. It arrived awkwardly, without instruction, forcing them to redefine who they were without the constant presence of an unanswered question. Some found relief in that quiet. Others struggled, feeling as though letting go might somehow betray the years they spent waiting. Dreams changed. Nightmares softened. The past no longer intruded with the same force. But it did not disappear. It lingered at the edges of memory, less sharp, more reflective. Grief did not end. It simply learned how to coexist with truth. The community adjusted in subtle ways. The case became part of local history, discussed in classrooms as an example of perseverance and the evolution of justice. Students listened, wide-eyed, surprised that something so significant could have remained hidden for so long. They asked questions that once had no answers. Now they did. Journalists revisited their own roles. Some reread old articles, cringing at assumptions made, at certainty expressed too early. Others felt pride, knowing that persistence, even imperfect, had helped keep the story alive long enough for the truth to emerge. The media cycle moved on, but the lesson stayed. Late one evening, a former detective sat alone, watching an old interview recorded years before the breakthrough. He noticed details he had missed then. A pause, a glance away from the camera, a sentence that now carried a different meaning. It struck him how perspective can change not only what we see, but what we understand. The justice system continued its slow, grinding motion. Paperwork, appeals, hearings scheduled months in advance. It was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. But it was necessary. Justice, when stripped of spectacle, is patient. It waits its turn. The convicted man's name faded further from conversation, becoming less a person and more a reference point, a reminder that the past is never as distant as it feels. That actions echo, no matter how long it takes for the sound to return. Across Arkansas, families of other victims watched closely, some with hope, some with skepticism, some afraid to believe that their own unanswered questions might one day find resolution. The solved case did not promise miracles. It offered something quieter, possibility. And in that possibility lived a strange comfort, the idea that time does not only take. Sometimes it gives back. Sometimes it preserves what we think has been lost, waiting for the moment when someone is finally ready to look again. The case no longer dominated the present, but it shaped the future in ways no one could fully measure. A ripple spreading outward, touching lives that had never known the original crime. Proof that even after decades of silence, the truth can still speak. And when it does, it changes the way the world listens. As the years pressed forward, the case settled into a strange afterlife, no longer urgent but never dormant. It lived in margins, in conversations that started about something else and slowly drifted back, in pauses during interviews when someone remembered exactly where they were when the news finally broke, in the way people stopped mid-sentence, realizing how close certainty had come to never arriving at all. The evidence that changed everything was now archived again, sealed with new labels, new conclusions, new authority. It sat in climate-controlled silence, no longer a question mark, but a period. And yet, its journey echoed louder than its destination, a reminder that answers do not announce themselves. They wait, they endure neglect, they survive doubt. Investigators who had not been part of the original work studied the file with fresh eyes, not out of necessity, but reverence. They traced the timeline backward, reconstructing the missteps, the blind spots, the moments where momentum stalled, not to assign blame, but to understand how easily truth can slip past when pressure, fatigue, or certainty closes a door too soon. Some nights, those investigators lay awake, thinking about the cases still unresolved, about rooms filled with boxes no one had opened in years, about families who had learned to live with not knowing because the alternative felt too dangerous. The Arkansas case had cracked something open, not just evidence, but mindset. For the families, the silence after resolution felt heavier than expected. There were no more updates to wait for, no more theories to debate, no more phone calls that might change everything. Closure did not arrive with relief alone. It arrived with a quiet disorientation. When a question defines your life for decades, its absence leaves space that must be relearned. They filled that space differently. Some volunteered. Some moved away. Some stayed rooted, unwilling to let the past be erased by distance. They spoke of their loved ones in present tense sometimes, catching themselves, smiling faintly, refusing to correct it. Memory had its own grammar. The town, too, adjusted its narrative. What had once been a cautionary tale became a lesson in patience. Murals were repainted. Old rumors lost their power. Names once whispered were spoken plainly, stripped of speculation. Truth had a way of simplifying things, even when it complicated everything else. In court transcripts and legal briefs, the language was dry, precise, almost sterile. But behind every sentence lived decades of waiting. Behind every procedural step stood people who had grown older alongside the case, measuring their lives against its inertia. The system, often criticized for slowness, revealed another side of itself. Not swift, not elegant, but capable of remembering, capable of correcting, capable, even after all that time, of saying, this mattered enough to finish. There were moments of anger still, at what had been missed, at how long it took, at the years that could never be returned. Those emotions did not vanish with resolution. They simply found a new place to rest. And yet, something undeniable remained. A sense that the world, imperfect and fractured as it is, had bent slightly toward balance, that the scales, long tipped, had finally shifted. Even if only by degrees, the case no longer demanded attention, but it commanded respect. It stood as evidence that silence is not proof of absence, that the past is not fixed, that truth can survive neglect. Waiting patiently for the moment when someone is willing to listen without assumptions. In the end, the story was not just about a crime or an arrest. It was about time's ability to both conceal and reveal, about the fragile persistence of facts, about the idea that even after decades of unanswered questions, the truth does not forget where it belongs. Time did not slow after the arrest. If anything, it accelerated, rushing to fill the vacuum left behind by decades of uncertainty. News cycles moved on. Headlines shortened. What had once consumed entire front pages was reduced to a paragraph, then a footnote, then a line in an archive few people would ever search again. But for those who had lived inside the case, time behaved differently. It stretched. It pressed. It reminded them that resolution does not rewind anything. It only redraws the present. The accused sat in a cell built for the now, not the past. The walls were clean. The lights were fluorescent. Nothing about the room reflected the weight of 40 years. And yet that weight followed him, invisible but constant, carried in the knowledge that a life once lived freely had been reinterpreted by a single piece of long-lost evidence. There were no grand speeches, no cinematic confessions, just paperwork, procedure, and the quiet hum of inevitability. Across town, the victim's name began appearing in places it had never been allowed before, spoken at community meetings without hesitation, printed on plaques without controversy. The fear of being wrong had evaporated, replaced by the certainty of having waited too long. Teachers mentioned the case's history now, not rumor. Students listened differently, sensing that this was not just a lesson about crime, but about time's ability to distort justice until someone forces it back into focus. Investigators were asked, again and again, how it felt to finally solve it. Most struggled to answer. Satisfaction felt like the wrong word. Victory felt inappropriate. What they felt instead was relief tempered by humility, the understanding that for every case closed, there were dozens still frozen, waiting for a moment that might never come. The Arkansas file had been lucky, not because of brilliance or persistence alone, but because something small had survived long enough to be believed. The evidence itself became almost mythical in retelling, a fragment, a detail, something overlooked because it seemed insignificant at the time. People clung to that idea, not because it was dramatic, but because it was comforting. It suggested that truth was durable, that even neglect could not erase it entirely, that somewhere in a box or a drawer or forgotten envelope, answers might still exist. But comfort came with discomfort, the realization that systems are only as sharp as the people running them, that assumptions can age poorly, that certainty, once settled too early, can harden into error. The case became a mirror held up to every unsolved file in the state, asking the same uncomfortable question. What if something is still there, waiting to be seen? Families of other victims reached out, cautiously at first. Letters arrived. Emails followed. They asked not for miracles, but for reconsideration, for another look, for permission to hope without feeling foolish. The investigators answered when they could, knowing that hope was not a resource they could distribute evenly. In private moments, some of them returned to the crime scene photographs, not out of obligation, but out of respect. They studied the grainy images, the outdated techniques, the handwritten notes. They imagined the original investigators doing the best they could with what they had, unaware that time itself would become both obstacle and ally. The town changed slowly, then all at once. New businesses opened where old ones had closed. Streets were renamed. Children grew up without knowing the case at all, until someone older mentioned it and watched their expressions shift from curiosity to disbelief. How could something like that remain unanswered for so long? The question was simple. The answer never was. What lingered most was not the crime, but the waiting, the years of suspended breath, the birthdays marked by absence, the holidays shaped by silence. Those things did not disappear when the truth arrived. They simply took on a different shape, less sharp, but no less real. And in that reshaped space, a quiet understanding settled in, that justice, when delayed, does not arrive cleanly. It arrives carrying the weight of everything it could not fix, but it arrives nonetheless. And sometimes that is enough to change the way a story ends, even if it cannot change how it began. In the final stretch, when the paperwork was signed and the courtroom emptied, silence returned in a form no one had anticipated. It was not the tense silence of uncertainty, nor the heavy silence of fear, but something thinner, more fragile, like the quiet after a storm when the ground is still wet and the air smells changed. The case was officially closed, stamped, archived, labeled solved, yet nothing about it felt finished. Closure, it turned out, was not a door slamming shut, but a room slowly losing its echo. The courtroom benches bore the impressions of people who had waited decades to sit there. Some had imagined this day 1,000 different ways. None of those versions matched reality. There was no thunderous declaration, no cinematic gasp, no collective exhale that erased the past. There was only a judge's voice, steady and procedural, reciting facts that had once been speculation, naming actions that had once been whispered, turning rumor into record. The words fell into room and stayed there, heavy, undeniable. Outside, cameras waited, hungry for finality. Reporters asked whether justice had been served. The question floated in the air, awkward and incomplete. Justice for whom? Justice compared to what? Justice measured against how much time had already been taken. Answers came carefully, wrapped in caution, because everyone understood the truth. Justice delayed is not justice restored, only justice acknowledged. The accused was led away without drama. No outburst. No last words meant to redefine the story. Just footsteps on polished floors, the sound echoing briefly before fading. Those who watched understood something unsettling in that moment. The end of a mystery does not always feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like exposure, like the sudden light revealing how much darkness had been allowed to accumulate unnoticed. The victim's name was spoken one last time that day, not as a question, not as a plea, but as a fact. Anchored, permanent. It no longer belonged to speculation or theory. It belonged to history. And history, unlike memory, does not argue back. In the weeks that followed, life resumed its ordinary rhythm. Stores opened. Schools rang their bells. People complained about traffic and weather and things that felt small but necessary. Yet beneath that normalcy, the case lingered, woven into the town's identity in a new way, not as an open wound, but as a scar, visible, instructive, impossible to ignore once you knew where to look. Investigators returned to their desks, to other files, other names, other unanswered questions. But something had shifted. Every old box now carried a different weight. Every overlooked detail demanded a second glance. The Arkansas case had taught them that time does not erase truth. It only hides it, and hiding places have a way of failing eventually. Families gathered privately, away from cameras and headlines. They spoke of what had been lost, of years that could never be reclaimed, of conversations that would never happen. But they also spoke of something new, certainty. Painful, imperfect certainty, but certainty nonetheless. And in that certainty, they found a fragile kind of peace. Not because the story ended well, but because it finally ended honestly. As months passed, the case receded from daily conversation, but it never fully disappeared. It resurfaced in quiet moments, in passing remarks, in the way people paused when they heard similar stories from other places. It became a reference point, a reminder that answers can come late, but they can come, and somewhere, in an evidence room now better organized than it once was, an empty space remained where the long-lost proof had once sat, unnoticed and silent, waiting decades to speak. Its absence told its own story, a story about patience, about persistence, about the thin line between forgotten and found. The mystery was over, but the lesson endured. That truth is resilient. That time is not neutral. And that even after 40 years, a single overlooked detail can still rise up, point backward to the darkness, and force the present to finally confront the past.